You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
Two social workers sat behind a desk, looking across the table at a very nervous-looking couple. The social workers tackled troubling cases all the time, but this one was especially hard to stomach. That day, a doctor had called the social workers about an infant that the doctor was sure was being abused. He said this case was very serious and he wanted the social workers to come and take custody of this child right now, before anybody else could hurt this little girl again. The social workers had gone over to the hospital right away, and the evidence the doctor showed them was truly shocking. From what they could see, this 3-month-old baby hadn't just been hurt once, but many, many times. The parents denied doing anything to their child and talked about how much they cared for their child, but the social workers had seen plenty of crocodile tears before, and so they knew whatever happened next, this couple would not be going home with their baby. And frankly, if the social workers had their way, these parents would never come anywhere near their baby ever again. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So if you like today's story, please replace the Follow Button's toothpaste with garlic paste. This episode is called Glass Baby. On the morning of June 16th, 2008, Tiffany O'Shell was washing dishes in the kitchen when she heard a familiar rustling sound coming through the baby monitor on the counter. Her 3-month-old daughter, Alyssa, had just woken up. Tiffany dried her hands on a towel, then took off the bandana that had been keeping her short red hair out of her face. She heard Alyssa start to hiccup on the monitor, and instinctively, Tiffany almost called out for her husband, Dave, to go check on the baby, but then she remembered that Dave had actually already left for work. He was a police officer with the Lakewood Police Department in Lakewood, Colorado. Tiffany used to work with Dave at the Lakewood Police Department, but she'd quit a couple of months before Alyssa was born. Having 2 full-time cops in the family was too hard with a new baby. Now she just worked part-time as a guard at a halfway house for former criminals. It didn't pay as much as being a full-time cop, but the hours were far more flexible. Tiffany walked into the baby's room and gently took Alyssa from her crib. Alyssa's bright blue eyes darted around the room, taking in her little world. Tiffany brushed a hand over Alyssa's mop of bright red hair and smiled. It was the same shade as Tiffany's hair. Tiffany could tell that Alyssa needed a new diaper, and so she carried her over to the changing table beneath the nursery window. Tiffany began to undo her baby's onesie, but when Tiffany lifted Alyssa's right leg up, her baby girl let out a sharp cry. As the baby cried and cried, Tiffany picked her up and examined her, unsure what had upset her baby so much. But the more Tiffany touched Alyssa, the more the baby seemed to cry. Tiffany tried to shift her from one hip to the other, but that just made Alyssa scream even louder. At a loss for what to do, Tiffany just took her baby into the living room, where they kept Alyssa's swing, and she fastened Alyssa into the swing and let it rock her, and soon the crying did stop, and a few minutes later, Alyssa was fast asleep. Tiffany was relieved, however she was still concerned. But she decided that Alyssa's sudden distress couldn't be anything serious, and so Tiffany went back to her morning chores. After Tiffany showered and dressed, she loaded Alyssa into her car to drop her off with her grandmother, Jackie, Tiffany's mom. Jackie was going to babysit Alyssa until Dave finished his shift that evening. Alyssa slept peacefully the entire car ride, and she didn't even wake up as Tiffany took her out of the car and handed her over to her grandma, so Tiffany assured herself that her daughter must be okay. It was late evening by the time Tiffany got home from work. She set her purse down in the entryway and then went into the kitchen to start dinner. Meanwhile, in the living room, Dave was trying to play with Alyssa, but from the sound of it, it seemed like Alyssa was really fussy. A minute later, Dave stood up and carried Alyssa into the kitchen so they could say hello to Tiffany. Tiffany asked Dave how his day went, and he would say it was all good, typical day. But then he said when he picked up Alyssa from Jackie, Tiffany's mom, Jackie mentioned that Alyssa had actually been a bit fussier than usual all day. Tiffany nodded and told Dave about Alyssa's outburst that morning when she lifted up her leg. Dave bit his lip and looked concerned. Tiffany waited to hear what he was thinking. Dave wondered aloud if they should take Alyssa to the doctor if her mood didn't improve by morning. And then in the meantime, Dave told Tiffany he would make dinner that night, and Tiffany should just go play with Alyssa because maybe what she really needs is just time with mommy. But the next morning, Alyssa did not seem better. When she woke up, Tiffany noticed that the baby's right leg was now swollen. Tiffany was totally alarmed by this. This was the same leg that was bothering Alyssa the day before. But Tiffany couldn't imagine what would have caused it to puff up so badly overnight. Very gently, Tiffany ran her finger along Alyssa's swollen leg, and the baby immediately let out a high-pitched scream. At this point, Tiffany knew she had to bring Alyssa to the doctor. By that afternoon, Tiffany was sitting in the emergency room at the Denver Children's Hospital. She was on the phone with her husband Dave, explaining that their baby's regular pediatrician didn't know why Alyssa's leg was swelling, and they had sent her to the hospital for more complete x-rays. Now, Tiffany was waiting for a doctor to come back with the results. Dave told Tiffany that he was actually in the area on patrol, and he would just swing by the hospital. A few minutes later, Tiffany was looking out the window when she saw Dave's patrol car pull into the parking lot. Dave hopped out and walked into the emergency room, and his worried face broke into a smile when he saw his wife. He walked over to her and sat down and asked her how she was doing. But before Tiffany could say anything, a doctor carrying their baby's x-rays walked into the waiting room with a very grave look on his face. He asked Tiffany and Dave to please follow him, and then without waiting for them, he just turned around and walked into an empty exam room. Tiffany felt her chest tighten. When she'd first met this doctor, he'd seemed really friendly, but now he seemed cold and distant, like he was preparing himself for a very difficult conversation. She looked to Dave for encouragement, but Dave just kind of shrugged and whispered that, maybe the doctor was having a bad day. A nurse was already sitting in the room when Tiffany entered carrying Alyssa, and then once she and her husband were inside the room, the doctor got up and closed the door behind them. Then he told Tiffany and Dave very matter-of-factly that he'd looked at Alyssa's x-rays, and he discovered that she had 11 bone fractures in both of her legs, all in various stages of healing. They would have to fit Alyssa for splints on both legs. These splints would keep her legs in place and help the fractures heal. Tiffany was totally shocked, and she instinctively turned to her husband, but he also looked totally shocked. Tiffany then turned to the doctor and asked what he meant. Surely this was a mistake. The doctor didn't answer. Instead, he clipped Alyssa's x-rays to the light board on the wall and started pointing to all the dark lines across the child's bones. Each of the lines represented a fracture. Tiffany and Dave looked at the x-rays and then back at each other in absolute horror. Then Tiffany said to the doctor and the nurse that she and Dave were both incredibly gentle with their baby and very attentive to her every whine and cry, and so she didn't understand how they could have missed these injuries. The doctor frowned and said that so many bone fractures were a huge red flag, and he said he'd actually already called the Adams County Human Services Department, and they were actually waiting for Tiffany and Dave right now in the hallway, and they wanted to ask them some questions. Tiffany could scarcely find any words to respond, and so she just kind of nodded and said she would do anything to help her baby. But then the nurse who was in the room came across and tried to take Alyssa from Tiffany's arms, and suddenly it dawned on Tiffany and Dave that the doctor and really the staff at the hospital must suspect them of child abuse. And so not only was their baby seriously hurt, but now she might also be taken away from them. Tiffany's breath quickened as she turned back to look at her husband, who'd now gone white as a sheet. She couldn't believe this was happening. All she wanted to do was grab her baby back and run out the door. But instead, she ended up letting the nurse take Alyssa away from her, and then she and Dave walked out into the hallway where the two social workers were waiting for them. 2 hours later, Tiffany was back home with Dave, but without their baby. The parents sat at the kitchen table, Tiffany weeping uncontrollably and going over what happened at the hospital. After the doctor had spoken to them, a woman in a brown polyester suit had led Tiffany into a dingy conference room and spent the next 45 minutes grilling her on her mothering habits and her temperament. Then she had told Tiffany that the state social workers were not going to let her and Dave take their baby home. Tiffany begged them not to take her child, but nothing she said made a difference. The social workers had already decided that it was in the best interest for the baby for her to be put in foster care. They wouldn't consider leaving Alyssa with Tiffany's mom either, since Jackie often babysat for Alyssa and therefore was a potential suspect as well if this was abuse. Tiffany was a wreck and felt like her heart had been pulled out of her chest. Meanwhile, her husband, Dave, was just furious. He kept pounding his fist on the granite countertop as Tiffany sobbed right next to him. The parents had told the doctor again and again that nobody in their family would ever hurt Alyssa. But the doctor said that Alyssa had what are called corner fractures, which would have been from violently yanking or twisting Alyssa's limbs, which is consistent with abuse. During her interview, Tiffany had tried hard to think of some explanation for Alyssa's injuries. She'd mentioned that maybe every once in a while Dave would hold Alyssa upside down, kind of as a joke, but she assured the social worker that Alyssa was giggling and laughing the whole time, and Dave only did it for like a second or two. There was no way that could have caused all these fractures in her legs. As Tiffany went over and over all the horrible things that had gone on that day, she just got up from the kitchen table and began pacing. Now she was worried that she might have accidentally said too much about the way they parented Alyssa, and that maybe she had unintentionally given more ammunition to the social workers to potentially charge them with child abuse. Tiffany and Dave would spend the rest of the night combing the internet for some explanation for Alyssa's injuries. Finally, after hours of researching, they found a condition called brittle bone disease, a rare genetic condition that causes bones to weaken and snap easily. Although Tiffany shuddered at the thought that their baby could have such an agonizing condition, she did hope that they had found something other than abuse that could explain their baby's injuries. At this point, all Tiffany and Dave cared about was just getting their daughter back. In terms of how to protect her and keep her safe from more fractures, that was something they could figure out down the road. But for now, they just wanted their kid back. 2 days later, on June 19th, Tiffany and Dave stood at a defendant's table at the Adams County Courthouse for a hearing on the next steps in their baby's case. Across the small courtroom were the two social workers who'd interviewed Tiffany and Dave at the hospital 2 days earlier. Tiffany's blood boiled when she looked over at them. She knew they were just doing their jobs, but she couldn't help feeling totally furious inside. She tried to stay calm, but she worried whether Dave could do the same. At home, he was an emotional wreck, full of rage and heartbreak at the same time. He'd barely been able to get dressed just to come to this hearing. When the hearing finally began, Tiffany's hands shook as she pulled her internet research out of her purse. She handed the printouts to the bailiff, who then walked them over to the judge. While the judge scanned the research, Tiffany began to explain how much she and Dave loved their daughter, and she begged the judge to please make the hospital test their baby for brittle bone disease. Then Tiffany did her best to remain calm, while the social workers argued that because of how the breaks in Alyssa's leg looked, there was almost no chance she had brittle bone disease. Instead, they felt that Alyssa's injuries were absolutely from non-accidental trauma. In other words, they were saying Tiffany and Dave had purposefully harmed their daughter. This suggestion made Tiffany feel sick, and the social workers' attitudes enraged her. It would be so easy to test Alyssa for brittle bone disease or any other possible medical reasons for all these leg fractures, but it just seemed like they were outright refusing, and they weren't even doctors. It felt outrageous for them to dismiss her concerns so out of hand. It seemed to Tiffany that the social workers were far more concerned with being proven right than they were about just reuniting a baby with her family. Tiffany was fighting back tears until she heard the judge say that other causes should be explored. Relief washed over Tiffany as the judge ordered emergency medical testing for their baby. Tiffany was so relieved that she felt lightheaded. For the first time in 2 days, it felt like she could finally breathe again. But the judge did say that Alyssa would have to remain in foster care until that new testing was done. Tiffany nodded and took Dave's hand, doing her best to maintain her composure. The last thing she needed right now was to come off as unstable. At least now she had a glimmer of hope that soon they would know what actually happened to Alyssa, and hopefully she'd be allowed to come back home where she belonged. The next morning, Tiffany was in her kitchen pouring water into the coffee maker for her and Dave. Dave was so depressed that he'd called in sick for work and had not gotten out of bed. Tiffany was up, but yawning from exhaustion after another sleepless night. Then the phone rang, and any hope that their life was about to return to normal flew out the window. It was a nurse from the hospital who was calling, and she told Tiffany that the social workers had scheduled Alyssa's emergency medical testing. However, they had scheduled it for early October, more than 3 months away. Tiffany could not believe it. Tiffany knew the social workers were trying to put off the tests as long as possible because they were already convinced that she and Dave were the ones abusing Alyssa. Tiffany knew the tests they were going to do would very likely prove that she and Dave really were innocent, but now they had to wait 3 months to do those tests? These were 3 months they could never get back with their daughter who was so young they needed to be with her. A week later, on the evening of June 26th, Dave couldn't stop his hands from shaking as he left work. He was on his way to visit Tiffany's grandfather, Charles Cooper. The two had become close friends over the years. Charles was a great listener, and the two men could discuss just about anything as they played pool and drank beer in Charles's basement. Dave was in a dark mood as he knocked on Charles's door. Then, after Charles opened it up and welcomed Dave inside, Dave followed the older man downstairs. Charles then handed Dave a beer and asked how he and Tiffany were holding up, and Dave immediately started talking a mile a minute. He said things were getting worse and worse and worse. He told Charles that he'd heard through the grapevine at the police station that Alyssa's social workers believed that he, Dave, was the one who'd broken Alyssa's legs. And if that was true, he would be charged with child abuse, which was a felony. Which meant there was a very real chance that in a matter of days, Dave was going to be arrested. And the reality of this was so overwhelming, Dave felt like he was losing his mind. Charles just shook his head in disbelief and asked what had made Dave the lead suspect. But Dave just shrugged. All day, he had been replaying in his mind the interview he had done at the hospital with the social worker, and the only thing he could think of that made him look kind of guilty was the fact that both he and Tiffany had mentioned that Dave periodically held his daughter upside down just to make her laugh. David stressed that he did this totally gently, but clearly the social workers did not believe him, and they thought that whatever Dave was doing when he flipped his daughter upside down was hurting her. Charles walked over and gave Dave a hug and told him to just keep the faith. But Dave shook his head. In a little more than a week, he'd gone from being the proud father of a happy family to an alleged child abuser facing a steep prison sentence. Dave took a sip of his beer and told Charles that he was terrified of going to prison. He'd heard horror stories of what happened to cops who wound up behind bars, and he was also scared that Tiffany would leave him if he was incarcerated. Charles tried to offer some comfort, but Dave was just too upset and scared to be reasoned with. Dave knew enough about the criminal justice system to understand that he would need money for a good lawyer, plus about $50,000 for bail, and if he did really go to trial and was found guilty, he'd lose his job, he'd lose his house, he'd lose his family. He just knew this whole ordeal was going to totally destroy him. Dave apologized to Charles and said he just needed to go. He wanted to be home with his wife, or maybe walk the neighborhood and clear his head. And without another word, Dave hopped up, he jogged up the basement stairs, and left out the front door of the house. 2 days later, Tiffany was at her parents' house for breakfast. She tried to eat, but mostly she just moved the food around her plate. She told her parents that she was really worried about her husband. Over the past couple of days, he'd been growing more and more despondent, and he didn't want to talk. He was convinced that his life was about to be over. Tiffany was trying to be strong and hold their family together, but it was proving to be a nearly impossible task, because as much as she wanted to reassure Dave, she was growing increasingly worried too. She told her parents that she had to be realistic. Even if she was not charged with abuse, Dave's legal fees could cost them their house. And if he went to prison, she couldn't afford to live on her own. She'd be a single mother raising Alyssa in her parents' basement. Tiffany turned to her father, Paul, and begged him to please help her save her family. She didn't know what they could do exactly. Her parents didn't have a ton of money, and nobody could convince the social workers to remove Alyssa from foster care. But Tiffany was desperate. All she wanted was to hear her parents say, "Everything is going to be okay." Paul laid his hand on Tiffany's forearm and promised her he would do everything he could. But realistically, the gesture just didn't make Tiffany feel any better. She felt like if she wanted to save her family, she'd have to do it herself. A few hours later, Tiffany sat inside of a small beige office in Denver with a dark wood desk and matching bookshelves. The shelves were cluttered with legal books, an old encyclopedia set, and all sorts of awards and honors. Behind the desk, an older attorney with a balding head sat leafing through Alyssa's case file. After talking with her parents that morning, Tiffany had realized she really needed to start looking out for herself and Alyssa in case Dave did go to jail. So she'd made this appointment in the hopes that this lawyer could help her get her child back. The lawyer kept periodically rapping his knuckles on his desk like he was totally lost in thought trying to think something through, to the point where Tiffany wondered if he'd actually forgotten she was in his office too. But then the lawyer coughed and kind of leaned back in his leather chair and looked at Tiffany. Finally, he spoke. He told Tiffany he had an idea. She should file for divorce. Tiffany felt like she'd been punched. She just stared at the lawyer, saying nothing, expecting him to admit that somehow this had been a joke. But then the lawyer explained that no, in his professional opinion, Dave did not stand a chance and was going to be imprisoned. And so if she wanted any shot of getting custody of their baby once Dave was incarcerated, this was a necessary first step. Tiffany felt totally outraged. She wanted a lawyer who would help keep her family together, not try to break it up. She told the lawyer she did not need to think about this. There was no way she was going to do this. But the entire ride home, her mind just continued to race. She knew that Dave had never touched their baby, and certainly the court would have to see that too. She couldn't just abandon her husband. How would she even talk to him about a divorce? And yet, when it came to thinking about Alyssa, Tiffany was just not willing to leave anything to chance. Tiffany knew she had a big decision to make here. She just hoped that when the time came, she'd make the right one. 2 days later, Alyssa's foster mom rushed into the ER at the Denver Children's Hospital and asked to speak with the doctor, who initially saw Alyssa for bone fractures. Alyssa was in the foster mother's arms, and both her legs were still in splints, and she was crying as though she was in pain. The foster mom tried to rock Alyssa back and forth and shush her, but nothing seemed to be working. In fact, the foster mother would tell the medical team that Alyssa had been crying all morning no matter what she tried to do to calm her down. Finally, the doctor walked into the waiting room and he called the foster mother and Alyssa into an exam room. The doctor gingerly took Alyssa out of the foster mother's arms and asked what seemed to be the matter here. As Alyssa continued to cry, the foster mom stroked Alyssa's forehead and explained that she was really concerned about Alyssa's lack of development. Ever since she came to the foster house 2 weeks ago, she hadn't been moving her limbs very much. Plus, her legs still seemed extremely sensitive to the touch, like they were not healing at all. She'd also developed a rapid breathing pattern that sounded raspy and forced. The doctor nodded and told the foster mother that she had done the right thing in bringing the baby back to the hospital. The doctor laid Alyssa on a tiny examination table and then began gently moving the baby's arms and legs. And as he did this, and as Alyssa continued to cry, the doctor would tell the foster mother that it did seem like Alyssa did not have the reflexes she should be developing by 3 months of age. The foster mother watched as the doctor tried to get Alyssa to grasp his pen, but the baby could not hold it. The doctor turned back to the foster mom and told her that he wanted to run a few genetic tests. And in fact, these were the exact tests that Alyssa was supposed to receive by court order, but not for another 3 months. The doctor also mentioned to the foster mother that he was supposed to meet with Tiffany and Dave earlier that morning, but they had not shown up. And so he told the foster mother that he would be sure to update Tiffany and Dave on this new plan to run these new tests sooner, as soon as they talked again. While the doctor continued to examine Alyssa, her foster mom stepped into the hallway. She called the social workers on Alyssa's case to let them know that Alyssa was back at the ER and that the doctor did seem to think that something else could be going on here with the baby. The social worker thanked her and then promised they would update Alyssa's parents. The foster mom hung up and then went back into the room to wait. But about 30 minutes later, one of the social workers called back to say that they'd tried to contact Tiffany and Dave, but both their phones went right to voicemail. The foster mom nodded and said that she just hoped everything was okay. Around 3 p.m. that same afternoon, June 30th, Tiffany's mother, Jackie, was also trying to get a hold of Tiffany and Dave. She'd been calling them all morning, but neither had picked up. Their radio silence really worried Jackie. She knew the parents had several important meetings that day that they could not afford to miss. At 8 a.m., they had an appointment at the hospital about their child abuse case. Jackie had expected some kind of update afterwards, but had not heard a thing. Then at 11 a.m., Dave was supposed to meet with his lawyer, who was going to take him to the police station to be questioned by the detective on Alyssa's case. Then at 1 p.m., Tiffany had an appointment with her own lawyer. Tiffany had not updated Jackie about what she was going to do yet with regards to filing for divorce or not, and as much as it pained Jackie to admit this, she did think that Tiffany would have to divorce Dave in order to get her baby back. Tiffany had promised to stay in touch with her mom, Jackie, all throughout the day, but now it was going on 3 p.m. and Jackie hadn't heard a peep. Jackie called Tiffany and Dave's house and their cell phones again, but still nothing. Jackie went upstairs to her bedroom where her husband, Paul, was napping, and she tapped him on the shoulder. Paul woke up and asked if she'd heard from Tiffany, but Jackie just shook her head and said she didn't know where they were and couldn't get in touch with them. And then she suggested that, maybe Paul should drive over to their house and see if they were okay. Paul didn't hesitate. He jumped out of bed, grabbed the keys, and then he and Jackie headed out the door towards the car. A few minutes later, Jackie and Paul pulled up outside of their daughter's house, and immediately, Jackie got a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. Tiffany and Dave's cars were in the driveway, which meant they had to be home, and yet their dog was sitting on the front porch, as though she'd been waiting to be let in for hours. Jackie and Paul made their way to the front door and rang the bell, but nobody answered. Jackie's chest tightened as she pounded on the door and called to Tiffany and Dave, but nobody called back. Paul had brought along a spare set of keys, so he pulled them out of his pocket and he unlocked the front door. And the second they stepped inside of that house, Jackie sensed something was wrong. It was just too quiet. Paul went ahead of her and headed down the hallway to the bedroom. Jackie hung back in the foyer and just decided to call 911, and just seconds later, Jackie heard Paul let out a blood-curdling scream. Paul had just discovered his own daughter and her husband dead inside of their bedroom. There was no note, but it was obvious what had happened. Dave had shot and killed Tiffany, and then he had taken his own life. A week later, Alyssa's test results came back, and one thing was absolutely clear. She had never been abused by her parents. She was diagnosed not with brittle bone disease, like Tiffany and Dave had thought, but instead with something even more rare. The baby had spinal muscular atrophy, a debilitating genetic disease that causes muscles to steadily shrink and weaken. Tragically, there's no treatment for spinal muscular atrophy, and in newborns, the disease is always fatal. Doctors concluded that Alyssa's bone fractures either came during her birth or just from normal handling after birth. In short, Dave and Tiffany had done nothing wrong. But the situation had spiraled so out of control that Dave felt like there was just no more hope, that he'd never get his daughter back, that he'd have to go to jail, and that everybody would think he and his wife were child abusers when they really were not. And so this is very likely why he chose to end his life and his wife's life. It's just this horribly tragic thing that was totally avoidable. After Alyssa's diagnosis, the court would grant custody of Alyssa to Tiffany's parents, Jackie and Paul. But they never received an apology or any acknowledgement that Alyssa should have never been taken away from her parents. But for Jackie and Paul, their focus was on the baby, and over the next few months, they did their best to care for Alyssa. However, as the doctors had predicted, Alyssa grew progressively weaker and her body continued to break down, and by the time Alyssa was just 7 months old, the stress and pain were too much for her little body, and she would die in her grandparents' arms.
And 31-year-old Larry Bader was living with his wife, Mary Lou, and their 3 kids in Akron, Ohio. Larry was a good father and good husband, but he was a terrible businessman. Over the past several years, he had launched several new business ventures, and they had all failed, throwing the family into fairly significant debt. And so even though Larry desperately wanted to be an entrepreneur and eventually start a quality business, they didn't have the money to do that. And so he had to just take some job in order to pay the bills. And so the job he got was a cookware salesman for a local company, and it did pay the bills, but it did not make Larry happy. And so on the weekends when Larry was not working, and if it was okay with his wife, he would basically just disappear and go fishing on Lake Erie, which is about an hour north of where they lived. And that was his way of kind of disconnecting from reality and kind of disconnecting from his somewhat crappy life. And so on Friday, March 15th, Larry approached his wife and said, hey, I'd like to head up to Lake Erie and go fishing for the weekend. And she would tell him, I got the kids, it's fine, you can go do that, but I heard the weather was going to be really bad. Are you sure that's such a good idea? And Larry would tell her, you know what, don't worry about it. These storms, they always hype them up. They're never a big deal. I'll be fine. And so he kissed his wife, he kissed his kids, he grabbed his stuff, he hopped in his truck, and he left and headed up to Lake Erie. That night, Lake Erie was hit with a massive thunderstorm, way bigger than the one that the news was predicting. And then the following morning, the Coast Guard discovered Larry's boat floating around on Lake Erie. There was minor damage to it, and it was missing an oar, and it was missing Larry. Larry was nowhere to be found. And so a search was launched for Larry, but he was never found, and he was eventually declared dead. And so even though the family did not have Larry's body, they would hold a funeral for him, and his wife was able to actually cash his life insurance policy, which was enough to pay for her and the kids. 8 years later, in 1965, Larry Bader's niece, a 21-year-old woman named Suzanne Peka, was in Chicago at a sporting goods show with a friend of hers. And as they're walking through the different exhibits, looking at different sporting goods equipment, they noticed over on the side of the building, there was a fairly large group of people gathered around this one particular exhibit. And so she and her friend she was with walked over to this group, and they kind of pushed their way through. And in the middle of this group was this man with an eye patch and a big mustache doing an archery demonstration. Basically, he was shooting arrows into a target about 30 feet away. And so Suzanne and her friend just kind of watched this guy for a couple of minutes, and very quickly they could see why he was attracting this big crowd, because he was just an incredible archer. He was hitting the bullseye over and over and over again. But as they continued to watch this guy, Suzanne's friend started to notice something unique about him. And he eventually turned to Suzanne and said, hey, doesn't this guy look exactly like your uncle who went missing on Lake Erie? And Suzanne was kind of surprised to hear him talking about her missing uncle, but she turned and looked at this guy, and all of a sudden she saw it too. He was a spitting image of Larry Bader, her uncle, although this guy had an eye patch and a mustache, but even with that, he looked exactly like Larry. And as Suzanne is watching him, she's thinking, Larry was known for being this incredible archer, and here this guy is who looks just like him, and he's an incredible archer. And so after this demonstration was over, Suzanne and the friend ran over to this guy with the eye patch on, and Suzanne says to him, hey, I know this sounds totally crazy, but you look exactly like my uncle, Larry Bader, who went missing on Lake Erie 8 years ago. And so the guy, he hears her and he kind of smiles and says, I'm sorry, I don't know Larry Bader. My name is John Johnson. People call me Fritz. I'm sorry, I don't know who your uncle is. I can't help you. But Suzanne, as she stood there staring at this guy, she was becoming more and more convinced this was Larry Bader, despite the fact this guy is saying he is not Larry Bader. And so she says to him, no, you are Larry Bader. I'm positive you're my uncle. Now at this, Fritz would be polite but firm, and he would reiterate that, look, I'm not your uncle. I don't know who Larry Bader is. I don't go to Lake Erie. I just don't understand why you think I'm him. I live in Omaha, Nebraska with my wife and my kids, and I'm on TV. I do sports journalism in Omaha, and I advise archery companies, and that's why I'm here. So I don't know why you think I'm your uncle, but I'm not. I'm sorry. And with that, Fritz turned around and he walked away. And after this discussion, Suzanne and her friend were not remotely deterred from what Fritz was saying. They were completely convinced this was Larry Bader. And so they ran to a phone, and Suzanne called her two other uncles, so Larry Bader's brothers, and she explained how she met this guy that is the spitting image of their brother. And they immediately hopped on a flight that night and flew to Chicago. And the following morning, the two uncles, along with Suzanne and her friend, they went back to the sporting goods show. They went over to the archery exhibit, and sure enough, there was Fritz doing his archery demonstration. And as soon as there was a break, Suzanne, her friend, and now the two uncles, so Larry Bader's brothers, they walk over, and the two uncles, as soon as they see this guy, despite the eye patch, despite the mustache, they too would say, this is our brother. And so they approached him and they said, look, I know you're saying you are not our brother. I don't know what's going on here, but you look exactly like our brother. And we have his military paperwork right here with fingerprints. Will you please just humor us and go to the police station with us and get fingerprinted? That way you can prove you really are not our brother. Please, we've been looking for our brother for a long time. This would be a huge favor to us. And so Fritz was annoyed. He didn't want to do it, but he's like, okay, fine. I'll go to the police station with you. I'll get my fingerprints taken and we can put this behind us. And so that day they left the sporting goods show. They went to a police station and Fritz had his fingerprints taken. And afterwards, the police would tell him, you are Larry Bader. When Fritz heard this, he could not believe it. I mean, he literally did not believe he was Larry Bader. It wasn't like this revelation prompted new memories and suddenly he recalled it all. It was really the opposite. Fritz immediately is trying to rack his brain to figure out, like, is my whole life a lie? But there was nothing. All he had was a contiguous stretch of memories from when he was a very young child as Fritz Johnson all the way to the present. But we now know that the bulk of his memories are all not real. He was never a child as Fritz Johnson. He was Larry Bader and then became Fritz Johnson only 8 years earlier. The timeline of what happened to Larry Bader is rough at best, but as far as we understand it, Fritz Johnson showed up in Omaha, Nebraska a couple of days or a couple of months after Larry Bader went missing on Lake Erie. And when Fritz showed up in Omaha, he just walked into a restaurant and asked for a job there, and he had provided documentation that showed he was in fact Fritz Johnson, and nobody thought anything of it. He was completely normal. There was nothing unusual about his behavior, and over time, Fritz just kind of thread himself into the Omaha community. I mean, he got married, he had a child, he adopted another child, he left his job as a bartender at a restaurant and eventually got this amazing job as a sports TV broadcaster for their local channel. I mean, he was like a minor celebrity in Omaha. Everybody recognized, oh, there's Fritz Johnson. He's on TV. Hey, Fritz, how you doing? I mean, he had a full-blown life. But as soon as the news broke that he was not Fritz Johnson, he was Larry Bader, right away, the TV station he worked for fired him. His second wife left him because in reality, he actually was still legally married to his first wife. And so his marriage to his second wife was never actually real to begin with. And so she leaves him. And then also because Larry Bader was no longer dead, the insurance company that had paid out all that money to his first wife as part of his life insurance policy, they demanded that he repay them. And throughout all this drama of Fritz finding out he's Larry Bader, Fritz continued to say he was not Larry Bader, that this was all a big mistake. He just could not understand how this could have happened. None of it made sense. And so eventually a team of experts, doctors, psychologists, you name it, they came out to Omaha and they ran Fritz, aka Larry Bader, through a battery of tests over almost 2 weeks. And at the end of all their testing, they concluded that 1, Fritz definitely is Larry Bader. So there's no debate there. He is Larry Bader. And 2, he is almost certainly suffering from an extreme case of amnesia, which is memory loss. But the doctors and experts had no idea how he developed this case of amnesia. And of course, Fritz, he too had no idea how he developed this case of amnesia. And it's unlikely we'll ever get any more clarity on exactly what happened to Larry Bader / Fritz, because unfortunately, just 1 year after it was discovered Fritz was Larry Bader, Fritz would die. He had cancer in one of his eyes, and that was actually why he wore that eye patch, and the cancer had come back and it took his life. Today, his case is considered to be one of the most believable and baffling cases of amnesia on record. Before we get into our next story, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, HelloFresh. Back during the beginning of the pandemic, we were not able to get groceries or have food delivered to our house. And so before long, we were down to eating just the Diet Cheetos and pickled licorice. And as I was eating my 77th bag of Diet Cheetos, I thought to myself, is there anything better for me to eat? And that's when I discovered HelloFresh. HelloFresh is like one of those things where as soon as you have it, you think to yourself, how could I have ever lived without this? They send you this neat little box full of meals, and there's all these incredible meals to choose from fairly intricate to very quick and easy. And so whatever your tastes are, they got it. But the catch is, they are not made. You are the chef and you make the meals. And before you tell me that you're a bad chef, I'm a bad chef, and I'm able to whip these meals together no problem because all the ingredients are perfectly proportioned, which also means you don't waste any food, and the recipes are incredibly easy to follow. So the end product is home-cooked, fresh, delicious food every time. So if your New Year's resolution is to eat better or to just stop snarfing as many Diet Cheetos, then you really need to sign up for HelloFresh. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com, use the code Mrballen16 to get up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. Okay, back to the stories. Just outside of the popular tourist town of Amaga in northern Colombia lies this thick green jungle. And if you know where to look, there is actually a walking path that leads you from Amaga deep into this jungle. And if you keep going, it will bring you all the way to this terrifying, enormous old railroad bridge that spans this huge ravine. Now, this bridge is no longer used by trains. It's been decommissioned. However, since its decommissioning, there's actually been, ironically, more traffic on this bridge, although it is the foot traffic variety. People come out to this bridge to go bungee jumping. Bungee jumping is a thrill-seeking activity where people will leap off of high places, like this bridge, and they'll jump with an elastic rope tied to their ankles. And so this rope has been very carefully measured so that when it is fully stretched all the way out, it ensures whoever has jumped will still not impact the ground. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez, who lived about an hour north of Amaga in the larger city of Medellin, she told her boyfriend that she wanted to go bungee jumping. This was something Yesenia had talked about for a long time, wanting to go bungee jumping, but every time it became a real thing and they were actually going to go do it, she would back down because she was just too scared. But for whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yesenia had the confidence and the courage to actually see this thing through. And so her boyfriend, when he heard how serious she was, he capitalized on the opportunity because he had never bungee jumped before and he really wanted to, but he couldn't without his girlfriend. And so now it seemed like she was serious. And so right away, he called the Amaga bungee jumping company to book a slot for he and Yesenia to jump off of their bridge. So on the day they were supposed to jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yesenia and her boyfriend hopped in their car and they drove an hour south to Amaga. And when they got there, they found the walking trail and they made their way out to this bridge. And when they get out to this bridge, they are amazed at the number of people who were already in line on this bridge waiting to jump off of it. They knew this was a popular spot, but perhaps they didn't realize just how popular it was. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they get in line behind the nearly 100 other jumpers ahead of them, and they proceed to wait. And over the next several hours, Yesenia and her boyfriend would have front row seats to all of the jumpers ahead of them jumping off the bridge. Now, it seems like Yesenia, in her mind, believed she would arrive at this bridge and very quickly she and her boyfriend would leap off and it would be great and so much fun. But now they've been forced to wait for a really long time. And this whole time, they're watching other people jump. And Yesenia is starting to panic. Suddenly, bungee jumping looked terrifying. It did not look like something she wanted to do. And so she was beginning to second guess her decision. And so her boyfriend, he's trying to calm her down and he's telling her, oh, it's totally safe. Look at all these people who have jumped. They're all fine. They're all smiling. They're so happy. You're going to be so proud of yourself. But despite his best efforts to calm his girlfriend down, Yesenia just could not calm down. But she did tell her boyfriend that she's not about to back down. She's going to go through with this. And so several hours went by of this totally high stress, anxious waiting period. And then finally, Yesenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line, at which point the staff members who've been doing this all day long, they signal the two to step forward and get their harnesses on. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they make their way to the edge of the platform. So they're looking out over this ravine and the staff members are putting on their harnesses and getting them ready. And the whole time, Yesenia, she's starting to get tunnel vision. Her heart is racing. She's totally panicked. She doesn't think this is fun at all. She just wants to get this over with. And then at some point, one of the staff members finally says, okay, jump. And so Yesenia jumps. Except it would turn out Yesenia had made a mistake. That staff member who had said, okay, jump, was talking to her boyfriend, not Yesenia. However, Yesenia, in her totally panicked state, had just not understood and had leapt, believing they were telling her to jump. However, the staff members had only put her harness on. They had not attached the actual elastic rope to her ankles. And so when Yesenia jumped, there was nothing stopping her from smashing into the ground. And so as soon as she leapt off the bridge, her boyfriend ripped off all of his gear and he ran down the bridge. He leapt over the railing and he ran down the hillside all the way to the bottom of this ravine. But when he finally got to his girlfriend, it was already too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined Yesenia did not die from impacting the ground. She actually died from a heart attack she suffered on the fall down, which means she must have realized after she jumped that she jumped too early, that she did not have the bungee cord attached to her legs. And so literally the fear of what was about to happen to her killed her. In early 1974, 31-year-old Michael Taylor was living happily with his wife Christine and their 5 children in Ossett, which is a small town in central England. Michael was described as a great father and a great husband who had an excellent sense of humor. In fact, neighbors, whenever they would walk past the Taylor household, would say you could often hear the sound of Michael laughing or the sound of him telling jokes to his family. But in April of that year, everything changed for the Taylor family. Michael had been doing some home repairs when he fell off of a ladder and he hurt his back. The injury itself was fairly minor, but it resulted in chronic pain. And this chronic pain quickly changed how Michael behaved. Michael went from being this cheerful, funny, happy guy to being sad and depressed. And he was so irritable that his family could barely be around him because he would lash out at them. Now, the Taylor family was not a religious family. However, most families who lived in Ossett at that time were. And so when one of Michael's friends found out about how poorly Michael was doing, they approached Michael and said, you know, you really ought to turn to religion for help and for guidance in this difficult time. And they also told him specifically that he really ought to check out this one particular Christian group. It was called the Christian Fellowship Group, and all it was a prayer group for Christians who wanted more religious support beyond just going to church on Sundays. But this friend of Michael's told him that the real draw of this group was the group's leader. Her name was Mrballen, and she was this 21-year-old, extremely friendly and energetic and charismatic person who just had this incredible way of making all of her members really feel like they belonged. And so Michael's friend was telling him that he really thought Marie could be the difference maker for him, that she could help him get back to normal. And so Michael, you know, he trusted this friend and he really didn't have much to lose at this point. He was already at rock bottom, and so he agrees to go check this group out. So on September 12th of that year, Michael makes his way to the church where this fellowship group is held. He goes inside and he makes his way to one of the back rooms in the church. And when he goes inside, he sees there's a ring of people sitting in a circle, about 20 people. And as soon as they see Michael coming in the room, they all stand up and they open their arms up and they say, "Come on, come sit down with us. Welcome to the group." And then the woman who had to be Marie, she stands up and she looks at Michael, huge smile on her face, and she encourages him to come over and sit right next to me. "Welcome. We'd love to have you join our group." And so Michael, for the first time in ages, is smiling as he strides across the room and sits down right next to Marie. And then as Marie began to lead the group in prayer, Michael did not feel his chronic pain. He just felt happy again. But when the meeting was over and Michael went back home again, the pain and depression came flooding back. It was like the only place he could be happy was inside of the church at this fellowship group. And so over the next couple of weeks, Michael completely prioritized this group. He went to all of their meetings, and over the course of these couple of weeks, Michael became very close with Marie, and apparently Marie became very close with Michael, to the point where the two of them would stay after the meetings were over, and just those two would sequester themselves in quiet prayer. No one knew what they did in there, but it just seemed like they were developing a real relationship. And in fact, many people in this group suspected they were having an affair. And before long, the rumors in the church had spread outside and were all over Ossett. And then before long, Christine, Michael's wife, was hearing from a friend or a neighbor that apparently Michael was having an affair with Marie. Now, Christine had already suspected her husband was having an affair with Marie because Marie was the only thing Michael talked about when he got home. So on October 1st of that year, only a couple of weeks after Michael had first attended this group, Christine waited until Michael had left the house to head out to one of the group meetings, and then Christine hopped in her car and she followed him to the church. And when she got there, she parked her car, she took a deep breath, and then she got out, she made her way to the front doors of the church, and she stormed inside, and she found the room where these meetings were held. She barges in, and she points at her husband, and she says, "I know you're having an affair with Marie, and you're going to admit it in front of this whole group." And Michael, who's sitting with his back to his wife in one of the chairs, he stands up, and instead of addressing his wife, who's accused him of infidelity, he turns and looks at Marie on the other side of the room. And when Marie made eye contact with Michael, she screamed. She would later say Michael did not look human. He looked like a beast, and he had wild eyes. And so as Michael is standing there staring at Marie with this very aggressive face, he began breaking out in tongues. Speaking in tongues is where the speaker will be saying or uttering words or sounds that sound like language, but the speaker doesn't know what they mean. The idea is some entity has come inside of their body, and this entity is dictating their speech. And so Michael is broken out in tongues. He's barking these words and sounds at Marie, and everyone inside of the room has no idea what to make of this. Everything has happened so suddenly, and it's so surprising. You have the wife suddenly coming in and aggressively accusing her husband of cheating, and Michael is not responding to it, and he's acting totally crazy. And then before anyone can do anything, Michael goes from just barking in strange languages at Marie to suddenly rushing across the room as if he's going to attack her. And when he does that, the rest of the members jump on top of him and hold him down. And despite there being like 10 or 15 people holding him down, Michael is still trying to get up, and he's screaming and snarling and yelling at Marie. And then Marie suddenly breaks out into tongues too. And it's only then that Michael stops trying to force himself up out of this pig pile that's on top of him, and instead he just continues to speak in tongues to her. And so the two of them are looking at each other, speaking in tongues, and the rest of the group is just totally dumbfounded, and so they just begin praying. And then after about an hour, Michael just collapses. It's like he went unconscious. And at that point, everybody in the room just goes silent, and they look at Michael, and then Michael kind of opens his eyes, and it's almost like he's waking up, and he begins looking around frantically, trying to figure out what had just happened. Michael would claim he had no memory of what had just happened to him. And so at this point, Marie would tell him and Christine that she believed Michael was possessed by a demonic force, and the only thing they could do at this point would be to perform an exorcism. An exorcism is an expulsion or attempted expulsion of a supposedly evil spirit inside of a person or a place. Michael and Christine were at a loss. They had no idea what to do in this situation. They were both kind of in shock for very different reasons, and so they just kind of deferred to Marie's judgment and said, yeah, I think an exorcism is the way to go. So Christine and Michael just leave the church and go home, and then the next morning, Marie would get in touch with the Anglican Church of England and would request an exorcism. And after hearing about what was going on with Michael, the Anglican Church would say, yeah, that does sound like he needs an exorcism. And so the following day, they would send out two of their best exorcists named Peter and Raymond. And so Peter and Raymond, they get to Ossett, they go to Michael's house, and they observe him. And very quickly, they determine that it does seem like Michael is possessed by at least one demonic force. And so they tell Michael, the only thing we can do here is perform this exorcism, but we need you to agree to it. And so Michael says, okay, yeah, I agree to this exorcism. And so would his wife, because she at this point is just completely unsure what to do. She's just going along for the ride. So a day later, on October 4th at 10 p.m., Michael, his wife, and the rest of the members of this fellowship group, along with Peter and Raymond, they would all meet at this other church in a neighboring town. And as soon as Michael had been positioned in the middle of this group in this chair, Peter and Raymond began the ritual by praying. And as soon as they did, Michael began screaming out in tongues, and he began writhing around, and he fell to the ground, and he began contorting his body in grotesque positions, as if the words Peter and Raymond were saying were physically harming Michael. And so after 8 hours of this, during which they had to actually tie Michael down to prevent him from hurting other members or hurting himself, after 8 hours, they finally just came to a stop. Peter and Raymond were exhausted. It looked very much like Michael too was exhausted. And as soon as they stopped the ritual, Michael just kind of collapsed on the ground as if he had fallen unconscious. And then at some point he kind of wakes up and he's looking around wildly. He's still tied down to the ground and he's acting like he has no idea what's just happened. And at this point, Peter and Raymond, they tell him that, the exorcism was mostly successful. We identified 40 demons inside of you, and this exorcism was able to expel 37 of them. So that means there's still 3 demons inside of you. Now, we can't do it right now. We're too tired. You're too exhausted. So go home, get some rest, and tomorrow we will finish this exorcism. We will get rid of those 3 demons, and you will be just fine. And so Michael and Christine, they get their things, and they leave the church, and they head home. A few hours later, around noon, a woman who lived near where Michael Taylor and his family lived thought she heard something strange outside of her house. It sounded like someone yelling. And so she went to the front of the house and she pulled the curtain aside on one of her windows, and outside, walking down the street completely naked, covered in blood, was Michael Taylor, and he was saying something about Satan. And so this woman, she calls the police show up, and they find Michael. He had curled up on the sidewalk outside of this woman's house, and he was giggling like a child in the fetal position. And so the police approach him, and at some point Michael apparently snaps out of it, and he starts looking up at the police like he has no idea what's going on, and eventually they would get him to tell them his name and where he lived. And so after calling in backup to deal with Michael, the responding officers made their way to Michael's residence. And so they go inside, and immediately, as soon as they see what's in there, one of the officers just turns around and runs outside and begins dry heaving. The inside of the Taylor family home would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in English history. A few hours earlier, when Michael and his wife had come home from the exorcism, they had gone inside, and then Michael had fallen into one of his trances and began beating his wife. And then at some point, she fell to the ground and either was dead or was in the process of dying, at which point Michael jumped on top of her, and using only his hands, he ripped her face off and flung it across the room. And then as she's laying there bleeding to death, he began rubbing her blood all over his body. And then after she had finally died, he tracked down the family dog and killed the dog as well. Fortunately, their 5 children were not home at the time of this attack, and so they were unharmed. During Michael's trial, the prosecution and the defense blamed the Anglican Church of England and Marie and her religious group for effectively convincing Michael he was possessed with demons, which caused him to act out violently and kill his wife. And so ultimately, Michael would be found not guilty by reason of insanity, and after only 4 years of psychiatric care, he was released. And today, he is still living free in Ossett. But despite the legal outcomes of this case, there are many people, both religious and not religious, who believe the Michael Taylor case is one of the only true demonic possession cases in modern history. Also, just to close the loop, we don't know for sure if Michael and Marie were having an affair, but it is assumed they were. And so that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please go to the like button's place of work 1 minute before closing time and then proceed to browse around for about 30 minutes and then leave without buying anything. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't